Donald Trump fraud, Jon Stewart, the overvaluing of his apartment. Let's break this down. Because the controversy continues, Jon Stewart has responded. We did talk about this last night on Timcast IRL. And this has to do with Jon Stewart criticizing Kevin O'Leary when Kevin O'Leary said Trump did not commit fraud. And then me calling out a misstatement, a factual inaccuracy by Jon Stewart, which has now been wildly conflated and incorrectly assessed by numerous people in the media because they looked at one tweet and they didn't actually watch my show or any of the shows we do. My friends, let me break down for you the gist of the Trump fraud case in greater detail and explain to you why Jon Stewart is wrong and what Letitia James has done to Donald Trump. The fraud case against Trump, it is wrong. I'm not saying Trump is absolutely innocent of all things all the time or anything like that, but certainly what we are dealing with right now does not rise to the level of any kind of civil violation. And what we are seeing is the New York government stretching their arguments to target Trump and the Trump family for political reasons. Now, we know Letitia James basically campaigned on, I'm going to go after Trump. But let's start from the beginning for those that don't know what's happening, and we'll address the Jon Stewart controversy. Kevin O'Leary, Shark Tank. He came out after this ruling where they said they could seize Trump's properties. Kevin O'Leary says this is insane. Trump did what literally every single real estate developer does. None of this is out of the ordinary. They're targeting him, claiming it was fraud. His lenders were all made whole, knew everything, did their own due diligence, all fact. But wait, you see, here's a key detail. Judge Engoron ruled summarily that Donald Trump committed fraud, meaning there was no evidentiary hearing. He received the documents and said, you know what? Trump committed fraud. Bang. A separate trial was held. In that trial, Trump's lender said, not only did we do our own due diligence, we actually undervalued based on what Trump said. That's what we do. Trump even stated in his financial documents to these banks, these may be wildly out of balance or incorrect evaluations. Why? You go to a bank and you say, I have this rooster. It was given to me. It's one of a kind. I think its value is probably $1,000. I could be way off. You do your assessment. Tell me what you think. The bank then comes, takes a look at the rooster and says, we're going to say $100. And then you negotiate a loan. Everything we're hearing is greatly exaggerated, but I'm going to break this down for you and show you the quotes. So Kevin O'Leary says this is totally normal. And what they're doing now, threatening to seize property, is going to drive people in real estate out of the state. It's going to destroy the market. Oh, let me show you the absurdity of the New York real estate market. So here's where I chime in. In a quote, Jon Stewart said that Letitia James knew Trump overvalued his properties because when it came time to pay taxes, he undervalued those properties. Now, here's the funny thing. In response to Jon Stewart's incorrect statement, I tweeted, did Jon Stewart commit fraud when he sold the property for $17.5 million, despite only paying taxes on a valuation of $748,000? To which all of these people in the woke press and all these, normie types or whatever say, what do you mean, Tim? You're conflating property value and tax assessed value. No, Jon Stewart did that. Man, it is really hard to break through the lies when you have disingenuous people. So I'll show you this real quick. We'll go through some of what the Blaze says, and then we'll break down exactly why Jon Stewart is wrong, the point I was intending to make, what Jon Stewart said, and then I'm going to talk to you about property values in New York and a key moment from the Trump fraud case, basically destroying the entire case, and the judge still would not dismiss it. So the Blaze actually has a really great breakdown. On the Daily Show Monday, Jon Stewart discussed where Trump's civil fraud case presently stands. Stewart argued that Trump's supposed overevaluation of his properties was not victimless, intimating further that those who do likewise in pursuit of profit are immoral, if not outright criminal. The New York Post and critics online intimated this week that Stewart might have his own phantasmal victims of his own. In response to the accusations of hypocrisy, Stewart lashed out Wednesday. However, his defense fell flat, absent an adoring audience ready to laugh on cue. You see, here's the thing. Let me read the quote. What did Trump actually do to earn this penalty? Stewart said Monday, referencing, well, it turns out that for a decade, whenever Trump wanted to get a loan or make a deal, he would illegally inflate the value of his real estate. Stop. Loaded. Illegally. Not true. You are allowed to make mistakes on evaluations, and you are allowed to then say, just so you know, we could be wrong about a lot of this. Here's the important thing. This goes back to is Donald Trump wrong or a liar? Now, I think Donald Trump lies. I certainly do. And I certainly think he's wrong about a lot of things. How you determine the two is difficult. And from a morally, philosophically sound approach, you have to prove intent when you're trying to convict someone of a crime. In this, the question is, with as large as the Trump organization is, and with as many people involved as there are, how involved was Trump personally? Did he personally do these evaluations? Does signing off on something 30 years ago change something you're signing off on now? And the big thing so let me just wrap that up. Just because there is a document that was signed by Trump or anyone else does not prove criminal culpability. There are often times when you're running a business where you have a manager come to you and say, here's what we believe to be true. And you go, okay, I'm looking through it. Looks good to me. The best of my abilities, I'll sign off on it. But you could be wrong. So Trump stated numerous times in his deposition, I said outright, this could be wildly wrong. Now, of course, what happens is liberals then come out and they go, but Trump claimed his penthouse was 30,000 square feet. But then in his taxes said it was only 11,000 square feet. Full stop. The government does the tax assessment. Trump's evaluation on the property value is different from what the tax assessor says. Tax assessed space in a building could be different from market value. And the entirety of New York City has this ridiculous, and I would say downright fraudulent tax assessment scheme. The city is probably doing it to attract investment. And if the city allows it, then it's not fraudulent and it's not illegal. Let me start here. I'll read this. Here's what he says. Whenever Trump, he would illegally inflate the value of his real estate. For instance, suggesting that his 11,000 square foot penthouse was a 30,000 square foot penthouse. We all do it. I mean, on my license, I'm not listed as 5'7". I'm listed as 30,000 square feet. Boy, there's a lot of context missing from this. One, I don't know. You're going to have to sit down and talk to Trump and ask how this happens. First, it could be Trump lied. And he said, just say it's 30,000 so we can inflate the value substantially. And some have actually said, we probably did inflate its value. Does that mean it's illegal? No. Now, hold on. It is possible it is. It is possible they were like, tell him it's bigger than it's worth more than it is, and maybe they won't notice. Certainly, I would argue that that's criminal. Now, hold on. We don't know that's the case. Let me tell you about the property I have, because I think what they're doing here in New York is targeting people who don't know anything about real estate and property. I sit right now in a building. We call it the Castle because it's a big house. I love the leftists who are like, Tim Pool lives in a compound with a bunch of people. No, people don't. There's a couple people who live here because there's a separate property. There's a separate section of the building. But this is an office with a studio in it and a green room and skateboarding. And it is not principally a domicile. Now, that being said, how would I divvy up square footage? I could tell you this. This is a 16,000 square foot property. And then I could file some paperwork somewhere else saying it's a 10,000 square foot property and an 8,000 square foot property. And you'll say, ha, Tim, you're admitting that you commit fraud. Well, first of all, I didn't say I actually did do that. I'm saying I could. Why? There is total square footage. There is commercial, usable, domestic. There's a bunch of different metrics by which you judge or are paying taxes on the square footage. In fact, my friends, there are even portions of this building that are unfinished. And so if I were to say the total interior space is 10,000 square feet, I would then say the total livable could be 8,000. I could say we have an unfinished portion, brown back, which is another 1,000 square feet. So if someone came to me and said, what's the total interior square feet? And I said 11,000, meaning the property is worth X. Then I was asked later, what's the total livable square feet? I said 8,000. That's not lying. That's different. So the question is, in the nitty gritty, by all means, liberals, tell me that Trump was saying total square footage and they were wrong. And I'll say, okay, now the question is, was it Trump personally? This is important, I know. And you're going to, if an employee did it and got it wrong, and they said it was wrong, it really falls down to the due diligence of the lender to check. For all we know, somebody confused two different properties. That's the mistake. Trump's got so many properties, so you have to prove intent. And I'm fine if you do, but there was no trial. The judge ruled summarily that Trump committed fraud. They didn't even have an evidentiary. They didn't have a trial to go over claims and evidence. And certainly when Deutsche Bank actually came and testified, they said, no, we did our own due diligence. We actually reduced the valuation that Trump had given us, determined what we thought it was actually worth, and then issued a loan based on that. So we were fully aware of what was going on, and we were not tricked. We were not defrauded. I got the AP story right here. Ain't no joke. Banker involved in big loans, Trump's company, testifies for his defense in civil fraud trial, outright saying, we weren't defrauded. We did the due diligence and we knew what we were lending against. And they actually stated in one instance, Trump said he was worth $6 billion. They said, maybe 2.5, maybe even lower, maybe even 850. And they made the determination they were not tricked. That's the lie. Here's the important part. Let's go. Stewart said Letitia James, quote, knew that Trump's property values were inflated because when it came time to pay taxes, Trump undervalued the very same properties. It was all part of a very sophisticated real estate practice known as lying. And that's where my tweet comes in. Now, I'll send it over to Mediaite. These people are so lost in the story. They've not listened to what I actually said about this. They don't know what's actually happening. And what's happening is this. My statement about Jon Stewart committing fraud has nothing to do with Donald Trump and only to do with that quote. Stewart perhaps made a mistake. He has bad writers and doesn't understand what he's talking about. Stewart here conflated property tax assessment and market value assessment. So I highlighted his own property and said, oh, ho, look who did the same thing. They then deflect and go, Trump was an insurrectionist. This is what Jon Stewart says. Trump was an insurrectionist and he had a fake college. I'm like, sure. Argue all those things. Trump can't pay taxes based on his own personal assessment. Property taxes are set by a tax assessor, which is government. Now, as it turns out, let's scroll down. He said Stewart suggested the banks were victimized, having apparently been paid back at lower interest rates. He also suggested that since money isn't infinite, a person seeking loans who might have given a more honest evaluation could hypothetically have lost out. Sure. According to the host, when it comes to the investment community, in pursuit of profit, there is no rule that cannot be bent. No blah, 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 blah. We get it. We have this from Simon Atiba. He says, for those that did not watch, what Jon Stewart said, here it is. But keep in mind that it has now been found that he overvalued his NYC home by 829% after slamming Trump's civil case as not victimless. Stewart criticized on Tuesday podcast host Tim Pool, hey, that's me, dug up a 2014 New York Times article concerning his sale of a 6,280 square foot New York City penthouse to financier Parag Pandey for $17.5 million. The article noted he bought the property for $5.8. Poole tweeted, did Jon Stewart commit fraud when he sold his penthouse? I'm directly targeting upon Jon Stewart saying Trump paid lower taxes. That's how they knew the properties were overvalued. Wrong. The property assessment for taxes was done by the city. Trump could not have chosen to do that. That is a false statement. If you want to argue Trump committed fraud, we'll have the debate on that. I am simply stating Jon Stewart was wrong. The New York Post seized upon Poole's suggestion and obtained obsessor records. Stop! I actually obtained those records and I tweeted them out. And I included them in our second segment on this. The reason why I didn't tweet out the initial full assessor document was because it contained other information I didn't think was necessary. But later did tweet out the full thing, including the address included by the New York Times when we ran it on this show and Timcast IRL. The actual assessed value by the city was $1.8 million. According to the Post, the actual assessor evaluation was even lower. Okay, now let's play this argument. You've got Democrats saying the banks were defrauded because Trump lied to get a better loan. There is no functional distinction between lying for cash for a loan and lying for cash for a sale. Either way, an individual assumes a debt. It's nonsensical. If Trump said, my property is worth $1 billion, the bank then went, well, we just blindly believe you. Here's the $1 billion. Jon Stewart went, my property's worth 17.5. And the guy went, okay, well, I believe you. Here's a 17.5. The argument is that when it came to selling a property, the person who wanted to buy it chose to give that money for it. As if a loan and debt is anything different. When Donald Trump proposed, they give him this money. They said yes. They chose to do it. They lent him the money. In either circumstance, the individual either buying the property or giving the loan has a requirement to their own due diligence, which both parties in these scenarios did. So I am only facetiously arguing that Jon Stewart committed fraud because of his own statement. I know that may be hard for many of these leftists and liberals to understand because they're not quite smart people. Fine. The point is this. If Jon Stewart had an assessed value, market value, not tax assessed value at $1.8 million, went to someone and said, trust me, it's 17.5. And they said, well, okay, I guess. Then went to a bank and said, he says 17.5. Jon Stewart's lying tricked a buyer into getting a loan from a bank. So the bank and the buyer are both victims. And the buyer lost $4 million. Now, hold on. It's absurd to argue, right? The bank did their own due diligence. They chose to give Trump the money. Even stating in court, they lowered the value that Trump had claimed. This buyer knew what he was buying, looked at it, did his due diligence, said, I'm going to come up with that 17.5 million. How in any way is this different? But Trump said there was more square footage on this to inflate his net worth. And the bank came back and said, yeah, you were wrong about that. And Trump said, well, we did tell you we could probably be wrong. It's ridiculous. Here we go. There's more. The Post alleged that Stewart had done precisely what he accused Trump Monday of doing, paying, quote, significantly lower property taxes, which were calculated based on the assessor evaluation price. This is a large component of Jon Stewart's argument. Jon Stewart was arguing that Trump was not paying his fair share of taxes. Trump's not paying his taxes. Neither are you, John. Let me show you this from Zillow. I pulled up a random property from New York sold for $12.7 million. Zestimate set is $12.9 million. What do you think the tax assessed value the city of New York gave it? Well, public tax history shows that the tax assessment was $635,000. Okay, let's make this argument. Now, in New York, they do it on a percentage basis. It could be, depending on the class, it could be 6% up to 45%. So, sure, maybe this is the 6% assessment for taxes. Okay. There are numerous properties in New York that function on this principle. Now, as for Jon Stewart, his property may be a class 1, I don't know, but the tax assessed value, the market value was 1.8. The government said the market value was 1.8 million, and thus he would pay $748K. According to the county records, it looks like it was a class 4 property, which they list at 45%. So it seems like Jon Stewart knew when he bought the property at 5.8, it was worth substantially more, considering he went to sell it at 17.5, yet still paid taxes with his name on the assessor records at $748K. Pay your fair share, John. But this is New York City. It's how they operate. So I'm not going to argue it's illegal if the city knows this is how we do it. It's how everybody does it. And if it's how everybody does it, then it's not literally, I should say it's not functionally illegal, but it may be on paper. The question then becomes, why is a tax assessor giving these lower numbers on these properties, unless they're cutting a deal in the back room? Let's keep it quite simple. Donald Trump goes to a bank and says, here's my assets. Here's why I think I'm worth this. The bank then does due diligence and says, yeah, you were wrong. Trump says in his deposition, we told them these valuations were probably way off. They said, okay, well, we'll give you a lower evaluation. Deutsche Bank testified to that, but the judge had already summarily determined that Trump committed fraud. So it was done. They weren't allowed to argue they didn't commit fraud. So even when Trump had people come in and say, actually, no, he didn't commit fraud. We did our due diligence and we told him he was wrong and lowered the valuation and gave him a different loan. And Trump said, okay. They're like, no, he lied in the first place. Or he was wrong. They're trying to claim that Trump lied intentionally. But this is ridiculous. It's ridiculous because of the idea of due diligence and because of the heavy burden of proving intent. By all means, you may have the personal bias and the view inside you that Trump, no, he lied on purpose. And I say, okay. He lied on purpose in a document that also included the disclaimer, these evaluations and facts may be off. They may be wrong. And then the bank said, well, then we'll come in and check for ourselves. And they said, you're free to do that. And then they did. And then they said, we think it's worth less. And Trump said, okay, I'm sorry, that's not fraud. That's insane to claim that's fraud. But here we go. The Post noted that New York assessor valuation on Stewart's former penthouse is the exact same citation method and metric that New York Attorney General Letitia James used to value Trump's private and personal properties, and then sued him for inflating those assets. That was even the argument made by Jon Stewart. Parag Pandey apparently sold the property in 2021 at just over $13 million, a 26% loss. Sarah Rumpf of Mediaite suggested that it was unfair to suggest Stewart had overvalued his property, certainly not by a staggering 829%. This is where we get into the I did not do my due diligence phase of Sarah Rumpf, Mediaite, and the media, and the problem we face with trying to understand reality. In this, first of all, they call me an online troll. Yeah, I think 2 million followers, one of the largest podcasts in the country, and one of the largest viewerships of a live show. I think we on average the highest viewership for a live show on YouTube. Not trying to humble brag or anything, but certainly saying online troll. The New York Post made a curious decision to promote Tim Pool's laughably false accusation that Trump committed some kind of fraud regarding the 2014 sale of his Manhattan penthouse. The trick they're playing on you right now is to argue that I made a literal statement when I was breaking a false statement by Jon Stewart. First of all, I didn't say he did. I said, and I love this. My tweet, which I don't even know if they include. Here we go. I said, did he commit fraud? Because I'm not an idiot. And I said, I am shocked. And who did he defraud? And I showed these values, poking at the segment he did on his show. Perhaps you should actually watch my nightly show and my podcast before making an assessment on a response to Jon Stewart. What this individual then goes on to say is that we're conflating. What's happening here is Poole, Jacob, and other critics attacking Stewart are conflating three different types of real estate values. No, I am being facetious to target Jon Stewart's inappropriate and Letitia James's inappropriate conflation of different values. The actual market value of property, the property's taxable value assessed by a government agency, or documentation about a property's value submitted to a lender for the purpose of securing a loan. No, and I'll break it all down for you right now. Let's roll, baby. Banker involved in big loans to Trump's company testifies for his defense in civil fraud trial. When Deutsche Bank loaned Donald Trump's companies hundreds of millions of dollars, the bank always followed its own guidelines that include checking out information that would-be borrowers provide, an executive testified Tuesday at the former president's civil fraud trial. Okay, there's so much to break down in this. The important fact here is that Donald Trump testified, I believe 3 times, may have been 2 times, that when we submitted this information, we told the bank the evaluations and values in this could be way off. They may or may not be exaggerated or off. And the bank said, it's fine because we do our own evaluations, which they did. They go to mention Deutsche Bank reviewed the financial statements before making the loans, a pathway, they say, through its department that works with rich individuals. Democrats argue that because Trump got the loan based on his personal net worth and not against commercial real estate, he was securing more favorable terms. Yes, and the bank knew that. The argument from Letitia James is that Trump overvalued his real estate to the bank, going outside of commercial real estate lending and to rich individuals' department so that he would get cheaper, lower interest rates. But the bank knew exactly what Trump was doing and even stated, this is the Associated Press reporting this. He says, at times the bank pegged Trump's wealth at several $billion lower than he did, according to documents and testimony. In 2019, for example, Trump's financial statements listed his net worth at $5.8 billion, which the bank adjusted down to $2.5 billion. Williams said such differences weren't necessarily unusual or alarming. It's a conservative measure to make these adjustments, characterizing them as standard and a stress test. The Attorney General's office, however, maintained such adjustments were never intended to account for alleged fraud. That's ridiculous and not true. When the bank, they say Trump acted as the guarantor for the loans and was quick to act when the bank raised concerns that properties weren't generating enough cash to make payments. This is what the banker testified. At what point Trump moved $8.6 million into the Washington hotel's coffers after its cash flow fell short of a requirement. The payments, no payments were missed, and the loans were never found to be in default. So let's start this over. Donald Trump wants a loan. He goes to Deutsche Bank's rich individuals department saying, I'm wealthy, I'm worth billions of dollars, I've got all this property and all these companies. I need a loan of this amount of money so that I can purchase this building. The building in question is the DC hotel, for which Trump generated for himself personally $128 million. He then says to them, here's a list of all my assets. Boom. It may or may not be off. Some of it may or may not be exaggerated. Trump testified that was the case. The bank then said, okay, well, we're going to evaluate these documents and go through them and see if they're true or not. The bank then came back and said, actually, Trump, we think you're not worth this much. So we're not going to give you a loan at this higher rate. We're going to give you a loan at this number, but we think we're good. Later, the bank came to Trump and said, we think that you're not good. Your cash requirements are not being met. And Trump said, let me put the money into the accounts and make sure it stays whole. And they said, okay, the bank got paid back. Trump generated profit. Everybody was happy. The bank did their due diligence. They knew the documents given to them may have been exaggerated. There was no lie. There was no malintent. Democrats in this case are stripping context to make you think Trump gave the documents to the bank, said all of this is 100% true. The bank went, well, I'll take your word for it, gave him the loan. And then they say, even though they made money, Trump was lying to secure a loan. And that's the fraud in question. The only problem is the fact that in real estate and in business, companies choose to engage in the business. So if Jon Stewart, let's go back to the main point, argues that a property valued by the state at $1.8 million, for which he's paying taxes on an evaluation of $748,000, if he attests to a buyer, actually it's $17.5 million. And if you want it, you got to give me it. The guy says, sure. Turns out the property wasn't worth that. It was worth way less. And the guy lost a bunch of money. Now, of course, you'd argue that's silly. The buyer chose to buy the property. Well, I argue that's silly. The bank chose to buy the debt from Trump. There's no functional difference. The bank said, do we want to purchase $200 million in debt from Donald Trump? His business, based on our evaluation, looks good, and it looks like he'll make it back. And when they raised concerns, Trump said, don't worry about it, and made sure it was met. So the argument here is the purchasing of debt versus the purchasing of a physical property. In each instance, we argue the buyer has a responsibility to do their own due diligence. Jon Stewart could be argued, said $17.5 million, that's the value, and that's what I want to sell it for. But he was paying taxes on $748, and the city said it was only worth $1.8. I want to make sure I stress that very, very much so for our friends over at Mediaite. The actual market value of the property, what someone would be willing to pay for it. The property's taxable value, full stop. There's a fourth you missed, and that is the market value determined by the state. That's how they determine the tax assessed value. New York said Jon Stewart's property was only 1.8. So who's lying? I think it's fair to say you cannot go after Trump and accuse him of undervaluing a property on taxes when you know that the city does their own evaluation. And that when he goes to a lender and asks them to voluntarily give him money in exchange for something, in this instance, the debt, you say, well, but the buyer knew what he was buying, but Deutsche Bank didn't know what they were buying. What? Both have to do their due diligence. Trump said, here's my list of assets. And this is the best part. We can't even conflate the properties of Jon Stewart with the assets of Donald Trump. They're not one for one. What is being purchased by the bank is the debt of Trump. What they want are assurances that he can actually pay it back. Jon Stewart is selling a physical property. The assurances of the buyer is that the property will transfer over properly. I am not literally suggesting Jon Stewart committed fraud. I'm poking a hole in the statement that they knew Trump committed fraud because he paid taxes at a lower rate. One singular and granular element of the whole fraud case. And more importantly, one granular element of what Jon Stewart said on TV. Now, I'm not going to sit here for 3 hours and break all of this down again. It is very difficult. But let me just wrap up by saying this. The problem of the media and the difficulties we all have in figuring out what is true. The Donald Trump fraud case happens. Millions of details, accusations, and potential that Trump maybe did commit fraud. I don't know. There's a summary judgment, not a trial. The trial that we got was after the fact, and it was about falsifying documents and not about whether Trump committed fraud. It was a separate thing. So what we have here is, let's separate the underlying fraud case. What we have here is Jon Stewart being wrong, saying on TV, and let me pull the quote again from the Blaze so I can show you. Going back up, Stewart suggested the banks were victimized. And let's see, here we go. Letitia James knew that Trump's property values were inflated because when it came time to pay taxes, Trump undervalued the very same properties. False. Trump didn't value tax assessment. The city did. That's the point I made initially. What happens then is Jon Stewart deflects with this nonsensical statement, and then leftist media comes out and claims I'm literally accusing Jon Stewart of fraud, when what I'm really doing is mocking him for his false statement. Now, here's the problem. The people who read Mediaite are going to make the assumption I was literally accusing Jon Stewart of fraud. The point is, what Trump did and what Jon Stewart did, neither of which is fraud and are different. Jon Stewart claimed Trump evaluated his own taxes. Now I've got people tweeting being like, Tim Pool doesn't realize the government evaluates the taxes, not Jon Stewart. And I'm like, duh. Jon Stewart didn't realize that. That's the whole point. So for those of you that actually watch my show and saw my actual breakdown of what this was, you know the truth. There may or may not be something underlying the Trump fraud case. Sure, I certainly think there isn't based on what we're seeing. And I made that argument for it ad nauseum. But what we're seeing here is the media breakdown for political power. This woman from Sarah Rumpelman from Mediaite writes the opinion piece without actually even looking into anything I've said about Jon Stewart, for which she might go, oh, that's what he meant. And here we are. Now, because the internet and Poe's law, and oh, don't get me wrong, I totally understand this. I tweet silly, nonsensical things all the time. But I think it's fair to point out, I quite literally did not accuse him of committing fraud. I said, did he commit fraud when he sold his penthouse? He listed it for this, but it was valued at this. Who did he defraud? I am shocked. And this is immediately following Jon Stewart's show where he claimed they knew Trump committed fraud because he undervalued when it came time to pay taxes. There you go. Have fun, Jon Stewart. I'm sure you'll write something up for your show on Monday and you'll get it grievously wrong. But I hope this was informative for all of you. Thanks for hanging out. Next segment will be at 4 p.m. and I'll see you all then.